Hello and welcome to the Stand Up for the Story podcast. I'm thrilled to introduce you to Eleanor Mills. Eleanor is a campaigner, founder, best-selling author, award-winning journalist and editor. Her book, Much More to Come, is a Times bestseller. She's the founder of noon.org, a platform and community of women in midlife. She calls them queenagers. Eleanor, welcome to the Stand Up for the Story podcast.
Oh, thanks very much for having me. Lovely to be here.
Yeah, lovely to see you today. So I'm going to start off with the same question that we ask all of our guests. What's the story that you're here to stand up for?
The story that I'm trying to change, that everything I do is about trying to tell a more positive story about the later stages of women's lives. I worked as a journalist for 25 years, and during that time I was also chair of women in journalism, and I was very interested in how women, as opposed to men, are perceived by the media. What are the kind of assumptions that we come to stories with? What's the lens through which women are seen? So I've been thinking about writing about that, doing research about that for about the last 25 years. And then what I began to see was that it became increasingly difficult to get pictures or stories about older women into the paper. And I suddenly realised that there was a real kind of gendered aged lens, and that the way that women were seen and valued in our culture through the media, through marketing, is essentially for being young, fanciable, and that is the kind of male lens on women. That's really what we're for. So when we hit 50 and we're no longer fanciable or so fecund, they don't want to see us. They don't want to think about us. And that for me was a real moment of, hang on a second, exactly the same as I was before. I'm now 50, but I'm still have agency. I have a voice. I have things that I want to do, things that I want to say. Why should I suddenly drop off a cliff? Why is it that I'm now being seen in, women are being seen in black and white? In a way, with only those qualities being recognised, when actually I'm a full rainbow of all sorts of things. And so I began to be really interested in what happened to women within the culture and perceptions of them as they get older. So everything that I've done at noon.org.uk, called it Noon because in the 100-year life, 50 is only halfway through. And I came up with this new word, queenagers, for women at this point. So I thought we desperately needed a rebrand. So I'm trying to tell a more positive and realistic and fit for purpose story about what women are for, what we can do, and trying to tell a new story about us at this point in our lives and going forward. So that's my kind of, what's my story? That's my story.
Yeah, great. So what was your personal aha moment of the nitty-grittiness of this story?
I've probably been made redundant at 49. So I've been at the Sunday Times for nearly 23 years. I was the editorial director, I ran the magazine, I was a columnist. I always had this very successful career. And then I was suddenly out. And it's a real moment when something that you've been doing for a quarter of a century suddenly comes to a close. And it's so much at the root of your identity. And what we subsequently found out with new research is, for me, my kind of horseman of the midlife apocalypse was redundancy. There's a whole host of things, a midlife collision that hits us at this time. So we found that over half of women 45 to 65 in the UK have been through at least 5 of divorce, bereavement, redundancy, looking after elderly parents who die, having a Gen Z child who's maybe in trouble with anxiety, some kind of anxiety disorder, not to mention a bit of one's own health issues, a bit of menopause, a bit of financial, domestic, mental, other kinds of abuse. That over half of women had at least 5 of those by 50, and that they often all came together in a kind of tsunami at around 50. And what's interesting about that is it's backed up by the research by David Blanchflower, which finds that there's an unhappiness curve, and the trough of which is at 47. And that's global research that seems to be true in all cultures across the world. So I think that's really interesting, this midlife. There's a lot of kind of jokey stuff in the culture about midlife crisis. But as we live longer, this, what I prefer to see as a kind of midlife pivot or transition or transformation or chrysalis for all of us, but we don't really talk about it. And I think it's particularly difficult for women because we've been so valued for being young and pretty and all of those things. When I wrote about being made redundant at 50 for the Daily Telegraph, they put a headline on it saying 50 and on the scrap heap. And that's very much the thinking in the culture. So that's really what I'm trying to challenge. And I think that the moment for me when I suddenly saw it, it's a bit like when you're first, if you get pregnant and you suddenly think, actually, hang on, women, it's not the same for women. I can remember sitting at home breastfeeding when one of my male colleagues was suddenly given a huge job. And I knew he also had 4 children. I was like, hang on, this is like manifestly unfair. I'm just as good as this person. And I'm sitting here breastfeeding on the sofa and he's just been given a huge job. There's a kind of dual track. And I think the same hits us with ageism, where we suddenly realise that we're being judged or we're being treated in a way which is not really anything to do with us, but is to do with another kind of characteristic, like being pregnant. And I think gendered ageism bit for women, the intersection of when ageism hits sexism, is really massive, and we really don't talk about it.
No, and it's right, heading towards 50 and beyond now. I just suddenly saw this invisibility appear. And I can remember working in a co-working space, and I'd always worked in offices when I was younger and always been part of the gang and chatting, and sitting in a co-working space in a room with 2 men who just had conversations with each other and would just completely ignore me.
Yeah, like you just didn't exist at all. No, I had that in a shop the other day.
Weird.
I went to complain about I was trying to take back a top that I bought for my daughter. And there was just something about the way that the shop assistant just treated me like I was so insignificant. She obviously just thought grumpy middle-aged woman. And it was like I just didn't exist. And I think that's very weird, particularly for women, I think, in our generation, where we've been used to having our voices count. We are a pioneering generation of women in that we have worked all the way through. We've expected to play a role. So that's why I also think it's different for us as we age, that we're not like our mothers who, my mum did work actually, but a lot of women didn't, or didn't define themselves by their work. And therefore, I think we're more content to take more of a kind of a helpmeet or backseat kind of role. But I don't think that's where we're headed. That's why I also talk about queenagers, because I think we just have a different expectation about how we'll be in the world and how we'll be seen.
Yeah. And I think looking back over life, I think having that wild kind of time in the 90s and all the things that we did, I found that suddenly when you go into marriage and children, I went in a few years later than other people, you see this side to life of the way things are with the privet hedges, all of that.
And the expectations of women within that. And also, Rachel, if you think about how we were raised, so one of the things that I talk about in my book, so I'm getting slightly jumping around, but so I set up noon after I left the Sunday Times, and I've written this book, which is called Much More to Come, which is basically telling the inspirational stories of women who have reinvented at 50, because in a culture where there aren't really any tropes for what we might be other than Cruella de Vil or kind of old witches or hags or grandmothers. And that's interesting because about 30% of Gen X women our age don't have children. So if you've never been a mother, you're never going to be a granny. And if the only story there is about older women is that as of them as grandmothers, that's not going to work either. So what we need is a whole load of, what your whole podcast is about, of brand new stories about what women are for, what they're capable of, what their lives can look like from this point on. And that's what this book tries to do.
Yeah, very well.
It tells my story of reinvention. At 50, I became a founder. I've set up Noon, which is a business. I've written this book. So my life really changed. And then it looks at the other women whose lives have really changed. And I think what's interesting, and I started off talking about slightly depressing research about all these things that women have been through by the time they're 50. But what we also see, which is much more positive and interesting, I think, is that the women who have been through the most, who've shed the most, who have changed the most, end up the happiest because they have a life which becomes resonant, which looks on the outside like they feel on the inside. Yeah. And I think for me, the much more optimistic story about women at this point is that I think 50 is when we finally get to become the women we always wanted to be.
Absolutely.
There's this whole bit between 25 and 50, which is about ticking all the boxes that society's given us that we feel like we're supposed to do from our parents, whether that's the kind of job that we do or who we marry or getting a house or having some kids or whatever aspects of all of those things one ticks off. And that by 50, whatever you've done, it tends to come to an end. We're seeing a lot of divorces at this point, a lot of people getting made redundant as they hit 50, people dying, parents dying, empty nest, all those things. contribute to this sense of having to start again.
Yeah.
I really think that whatever's been at the center of your life dies away. And rather than seeing that as being on the scrap heap or the end, I'm really excited by the idea that this becomes a new beginning, that it's a time for reinvention. It's a time to shed what we were and become something new. And of course, that's really hard. Chopping off bits of yourself is a bit like giving a plant a really hard pruning. If you chop off things which are alive, it really hurts. But it gives us an opportunity to go back to a kind of green, really strong green shoot of our kind of real essence and redeploy ourselves for what we might want to do next. So this can be an optimistic moment, but we have to recalibrate how we think about our lives. So if we're all going to live for 100 years, in the 100-year life, there's a new opportunity, isn't there, between 50 and 75? And we're lucky that we have the kind of health span now that we haven't had before. And this is a new chunk of life. The number of years that we live for has doubled in the last 100 years. So that's really massive. This is like a whole chunk of healthy life that people before us haven't had. And therefore, there aren't very many signposts about what it could be, what it could look like, because we don't want to maybe go and sit on the golf course or sit in the med and drink gin for 50 years. That's, I think, what I see certainly in the Noon Circle. We run these circles of women all over the country. I know you started coming to our one in Charlotte. Women who are full of vim and verve and drive and ambition and still got loads of things to do. And just because they're 50 or 60 or 70 or even 75, they're not wanting to sit on the sidelines. They want to get stuck in. But there isn't really a kind of map for what that might look like. So that's what we're trying to create at Noon.
Yeah, brilliant. And in terms of the real problem, where has all this come from?
Well, Rachel, I would say there is one word that would sum it up, which would be patriarchy.
Yeah.
We've lived in a culture for 2,000 years which has seen very much women as helpmeets, as subordinate to men, actually in law as their chattels. If you look at the marriage laws, laws around rape, women's bodies, women's lives have been entirely within our system subordinate to men's. And that's only really begun to change in the last 100 years. Women get the vote, we've got things like we don't actually have equal pay yet. But that shift out of women entirely being seen as kind of vessels or vassals of men is very recent. And we're kind of one of the first generations to kind of be able to live beyond that a bit. But I think that I write in the book about we're a bit like lobsters being boiled in a pot. We don't even realise that the water's getting hotter because we've been in it for so long. And if we begin to kind of unravel some of the programming around us, even in our lifetime. So one of the things I went back and looked at were the Girl Guides and Brownies manuals and these aren't from the 1950s, they're from the 1980s. And it's all about women being wonderful hostesses and looking after their husbands. And it's all about being pleasing, never asking for recognition for anything that you've done, basically being a silent helpmeet. And it's basically women being groomed by patriarchy to be good, kind of quiet, silent toilers and never to ask for any kind of credit for themselves or to think about what they might want. And the other thing that I think is really interesting, so Princess Diana got married when I was 10.
Me too.
Yes, so fundamental for us when we were growing up. And I would look back at some of the footage and Princess Diana, when she gets married to now King Charles, says, all I want is to be a wife and mother. So we were brought up in such a schizophrenic world in a way that we had Margaret Thatcher on one side and all that kind of, have it all, career girl, women can be everything. And then this very strong thing about, the most famous woman in the world saying, I want to be a wife and mother and being groomed by all that brownie stuff to be good hostesses. So I think that the kind of patriarchal view of what women should be and a newer sense of our own agency and what we might be able to do, I think, which comes from working for, 30 years, have been really kind of tussling inside all of us. And we see that in the political struggles of our generation. So it was when I had my first baby, I was allowed 5 months maternity leave. By the time I had my second, 2 years later, I could have taken a year. So those that's all been happening in real time for our generation. And so for me, the next bit of that is what we're beginning to talk about now, this whole kind of queenager piece of what are older women for. There's a whole new conversation about this because the existing tropes don't fit with what women like you and me are like now. And the demographics and the economics are really driving what I'm talking about. So women 50 plus are behind 90% of all household consumer spending decisions. And yet we appear in between 6 to 10% of adverts.
Yeah, I can remember when must have been about 18 years ago, and we were buying a new family car. And I went online and I did all the research and I chose the car we were going to buy. And we went to the dealership and they spoke to my husband, and I was the one that had the money at that point through an inheritance. I was the one who'd researched and made the decision, decided what car we were having.
It's not just 20 years ago, Rach. I bought an electric car like 4 years ago. Exactly the same situation. My money. My husband didn't even learn to drive till the children were born. He's not absolutely not a petrol head. I ran Jeremy Clarkson. I know quite a lot about cars.
Yeah.
Yet the garage did not speak to me at all. So that's just that's just like the tip of the iceberg, but it's like that kind of all the way through, and particularly around women and finance and financial planning. Less than 15% of independent financial advisors are women, and the whole way that conversation's set up doesn't really speak to our concerns. And yet women are going to be controlling 60% of all wealth by 2030. There's such a lot of shifts going on, and we're going to live to we're hundreds. And also the gender pension gap, it's even worse than the gender pay gap. Gender pension gap, 35%. Women are retiring with 35% less in their pensions than men, and they live longer. So what we're seeing is a kind of queen-ager brain drain out of the workforce, with lots of women being forced out like I was at about 50. And that matters because we're not going to get a pension of any kind till we're 68. And if we don't work in these years from 50 to 68, we're going to be pretty poor as we age. There's some real systematic problems here. So I'm really interested in how we challenge that story. And like you, I believe a story is the most powerful thing in the world. My whole career has been around telling stories. And I think that we can tell a different story about the lives of older women in the same way that we've told a different story about race or about homosexuality in our lifetime. If you think of the kind of comments that were completely normal when we were at school about, people who were disabled or people who were a different colour or people who were gay. It was hideous. So if we think how much that's changed in the last kind of 35 years, I'm hoping that we can have a similar shift in attitudes to older women and what they're for. And we're a quarter of the population and we underpin everything. Chairman Mao talked about women holding up half the sky. Queenagers are definitely holding up the sky.
Yeah. And I think at the moment, given the way the world politics are going and suddenly women's rights are starting to be threatened, that story is starting to come under, it's turning into a bit of a
Handmaid's Tale.
Yeah, and I think it's more important now than ever to change these stories and get them out there.
So do I, because I think that it's kind of pushing back. I mean, I don't want to be depressing, but I have to say I've spoken to quite a few senior women in the last few weeks and have shared with them a kind of thing that I've been thinking, which is that I've always thought that we were a wave that was going to get a kind of so far up the beach, and that our children, I've got 2 daughters, would get way beyond us. We were this wave and there'd be a bigger wave, and, we were just part of this sense of progress. I'm not convinced of that. I think we may have been the highest up the beach that women are going to get for a while. I really do. I think there's a big kind of pushback going on. And there are definitely problems with young men and with men in the culture. But I'm also quite worried that the women piece is so unfinished.
Yeah.
We still don't have equality on so many levels. I mean, 1 woman every 3 days being killed by her intimate partner. Still, like, only 8 or 10 FTSE CEOs being female. We're really not at a point where everyone goes, oh, it's all been all about the girls and the poor boys are really suffering. It's like, well, hang on a second. We're nowhere near equality as women. And yet we're already getting this massive pushback saying, the poor chaps. But I also think that we need some better storytelling in our culture around men. I talk about queenagers and thinking about doing something about what I call noble men to really try and kind of highlight the good men in our culture. There's so many lovely men out there. My husband, heaven, I know so many nice men. And yet they feel horrified by Donald Trump running around saying you can grab women by the pussy and, the kind of Andrew Tates of this world. And yet I think that they're a very silent majority, those men who support their women, who are actually quite up for a bit of equality. My husband's, I've always been the breadwinner. He was the mainstay of the kids. And when I go walk around my neighbourhood, I see lots of men now outside primary schools collecting children from school. But it's like that shift for men is not being heroed in the culture. I mean, your brand new story. We need a really good new story about the noble men who are kind of standing up and being more in touch with their their feelings. And I just came back from Anthropy, this big conference down at the Eden Project. There was one panel which really struck me. There was an older man. Must have been in his 60s. He was running Warwick University, and he had come from a very working class background, and he was talking about the lack of opportunities for people from where he'd come from in Manchester, and he burst into tears. And there was something so refreshing and powerful about seeing a kind of older white man of that generation actually demonstrating some feelings. So I think when I talk about noble men, it's also about men who are in touch with their feelings, who are emotionally literate, who are kind of heart-centered, not just in their heads. And that's been, for me, certainly as part of my midlife journey, my midlife story, some of the bits that we've shared together has been much more getting out of that very enlightenment brain, I think, therefore I am. It's all about what's going on in my head, into my body, into my heart, into a more spiritual kind of sense of things, or this idea that we are all one. And that's why I do think we can't other the men. We have to take them with us on the journey. And if women want to be in the world in a different way, then men have to do that too. And we need to work out what that looks like and what the story is that we tell about it.
Yeah, together.
Yeah.
So what needs to change?
Well, the first thing that needs to change is we need to start valuing women for all that they are, their creativity, their experience, their wisdom, their skills, their characters, the whole caboodle, not just for how kind of hot they are or whether they're mothers. And that needs to really change. And we need to really start seeing the value and appreciating the wisdom of older women. And I think that white Western cultures are spectacularly bad at this compared to other cultures in the world. I spent quite a lot of time in Jamaica. Older women in Jamaica revered, they're the matriarch, you don't mess with them. I remember playing pickleball on a kind of tennis court in Jamaica, and there were about 40 youths all playing football next to us. Now, if you were in a park in London as kind of 50-year-old women and there were like 40 young boys all playing football, I think I would be quite reluctant to step up and go, look, can you go and play football somewhere else because you're wrecking our tennis game. And in Jamaica, this one, the Queen Age she was like, oh, go and play at the other end of the field. And they immediately did without question, because she'd asked them to. And it's the same. I got Asian friends and Indian friends and things, and they say the same in their culture. The Queen Agers often hold all the power. They're in charge of the wealth. They run the family. So I think it's a particularly white Western phenomenon of valuing and that very kind of patriarchy in that kind of very particular way. And in some ways, some of the things that we've seen which are being hailed as progress, like, say, Martha Stewart on the front of Sports Illustrated in a bikini at 84, that's not the kind of progress I think that helps women. I mean, that just means, again, that we're only being valued for our looks. And that's, and I really don't want that kind of pressure to go on to like 84. That's not progress for me.
No. And that's just an older version of an archetype, the younger archetype. I think the archetypes aspect of that and the characters is really important.
Yeah.
So you talked about the mother or the grandmother or the old maid. And so it's having those new archetypes, those new role models of what aging can look like.
Sharon Blackie's just brought out a book called Wise Women, which is kind of reclaiming all the amazing kind of midlife and beyond women from fairy tales and myth who've been, again, like kind of Grimm's brothers. You don't see any of them in that. But actually, if you go back into the kind of folklore, there's lots of like the hen mother who would be the woman in the village who was a bit like a kind of midwife, who was the kind of earthy one who'd be advising women on their marriages, or there were kind of wise women and kind of witches who were healing, or there are lots of these characters. But of course, I think women who are not beholden to or controlled by men are very scary to the patriarchy. I mean, look at what happened with witches for 300 years. Any woman who dared to like hang out with other women or had some independent means or wasn't didn't abide by the very strict rules of their communities were condemned as witches and burnt or thrown into rivers. I mean, that's not that long ago. And so there are still lots of good reasons why women feel frightened to kind of raise their voices. There's a very strong genetic inheritance that when we speak up, we put ourselves in fear. I mean, I really felt that myself, kind of when I first started writing about this stuff. I would often send out my Queen Agent newsletter and feel proper fear and anxiety. And I remember I was speaking to our mutual friend Claire Dubois about that, and her saying, whenever you raise your voice as a woman, whenever you speak your truth, it comes with tears and fear,
Yeah.
she said. And the only thing to do is just to do it anyway. So
Yeah.
I really take that, and I talk about the fact that it's scary, because I think a lot of people look at me and go, oh, well, Eleanor's just super confident. But I think it's important to say that I find it hard too. It is hard. It can feel very exposing and scary.
Absolutely.
It's about articulating a new story. And when you tell a new story, which is about independence for women, which is about speaking up for ourselves, about saying we won't be valued through that male lens, then that comes with flack.
Yeah. And I think even Brand New Story has gone to work on me personally. We've known each other for quite a few years,
Yeah.
and it's kind of over the years. The whole thing behind the business is to give articulation, expression, a voice for individuals, for business owners, but also for the world.
Yeah.
And to, heal through those better stories. And I've been doing a lot of personal work around my menopause has really come up and bitten me on the bum quite severely. And so there was a moment where I looked at, well, where was the moment where I did not have a voice? And I went into, and it was a real moment of trauma from very early on where I was unable to speak. And since reclaiming those words, it's like a whole visceral, it's a physical thing. And it's almost as though those stories that we're seeking to change in the world, they really go to work on us.
Yeah.
And they turn us inside out, but they bring so much to our lives.
Yeah, I think that what's been most humbling to me and kind of surprising and touching is how much the words, the story that I told has resonated with other women. Every day I get an email or more from somebody saying, I've read your book, or I've just listened to you on Davina McCall's podcast or Rachel's book. I feel so much better. I feel much more optimistic about what's possible, that I was really kind of giving up. In fact, I had one woman the other day who said she'd been really suicidal, and that my book had really made her see that there might be a way forward. So I just say that not to big myself up, but because I think that there's such a huge kind of thirst for this, that there are, and so many women have said to me, you articulate what I've been feeling but didn't kind of quite know how to kind of put together. And I think that that's one of the things that I was a newspaper columnist for a very long time, you're having to kind of express the kind of zeitgeist, what people are feeling around you but maybe haven't articulated yet. And so I think I had a kind of confidence to do it, because that's the muscle that I've been using for a long time. But it was the first time that I'd really done it on my own stuff, on my own kind of original thought, as it were. But it's very, I think, to what you're saying about the stories that turn us inside out. I mean, for me, it was so humiliating being whacked from the Sunday Times. But from that darkness, from that sense of having completely lost my identity and who I was and having to remake myself, comes a real power. And I think also speaking from that pain or that vulnerability allows other women to come into the Noon Circle or read the book and go, yes, I feel like that too. I think when we talk about stories, my great friend, brilliant journalist, Decca Aitkenhead, she said she wrote a book about her husband dying. And she said that, I was like, gosh, how did you do that? Just before I was about to go do all the publicity on my book. And she said that when you take all your clothes off and you walk down the street, which is kind of what it feels like when you write in a very honest way, you allow everybody else to take their clothes off too.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I love that analogy, because I think that that's really true. And that by sharing the truth of how it feels to be 50, how it feels to be made redundant, what it's like when when your partner leaves you, when somebody dies, whatever, and how you reinvent those stories of reinvention, the nitty gritty of, this is how you do it. Not one day, I was a banker and now I'm living in a croft in Scotland. I used to hate those stories so much. But of the real granularity about how change happens, what I suggest to people is you go and do something which brings you joy. You and I both love swimming in the cold water, whatever it is, that you begin to put together the stepping stones from where you were to where you'll get to. And that's what my book really tries to do. And that's what we're trying to do at Noon.
And I think what's so brilliant about Noon is not just the book and the platform, the online platform. It is the community, because traditionally news stories and stories were told around campfires to build community, to build cultures. And when I went along to the Cheltenham group, it was warm. It was like that warming campfire. It was welcoming. It was supportive. It was fun.
Yeah.
It was, you know, and it was
Joy.
all of those things. And so, and it was belonging as well. And I think, you know, I noticed that I very much went through my menopause. I got married in my mid 30s. So I had my children late 30s.
Yeah.
So all the people I was bringing my children up with were about 8 years younger than me.
Yes.
So when I hit the perimenopause and menopause, they just looked at me like I was crazy. You know, it was just
And you feel a bit
everything went,
crazy anyway, so that's not helpful.
yeah, as Mel Robbins says, let them.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden now being able to go into that community of women, all the same age as me, a bit older, some bit younger, that sense of community and belonging was like beautiful.
Yeah, and I think that that's really key, Rach, because what we see within the new community is that with this sense of an ending, so I think Raina Wynn in The Salt Path puts it really well. She kind of goes, in the space that a great loss leaves, something new can grow if you let it. So in that process of transformation, you need a new tribe, you need some new friends to help you through it, and you also need some women, you know, who are at the same stage as you. And I think we need some big sisters, we need some ones who are a bit further along to kind of shine the light, saying this is where we'll get to. And what we see is so many women very dislocated from tribe at this point. Partly, you know, maybe their kids have left home and they had schoolgate mates and that's not really working for them, or they had friends in the workplace and now they're not in the workplace, or maybe they've had a partner who's retired and they've gone to live somewhere else. I just see a lot of women desperate to find what they seem to say the whole time, which is like women like me, like-minded women, by which I think they mean, you know, intelligent people who've done stuff, people, women with agency, that sense of we're not done yet, and really thirsting for that kind of company and conversation. And what I'm most proud about in Noon is all the friendships that we formed, these amazing friendships and networks. Feels like it's a kind of mycelium network connecting all these women, stopping them feeling so alone, stopping them feeling like they are personally, uniquely rubbish, because that's too often how women feel, when actually this is systemic. This is our whole culture not giving us a roadmap of what happens next, of making us feel like we're on the scrap heap because we're no longer, you know, kind of young and sexy. And it's kind of not about that. What we've lost in our culture is that sense of what the next phase is. And the menopause thing, I think, is really important, but I also don't think it should be the lens through which we see older women. It's a physical kind of rite of passage, which comes with this much bigger midlife collision. But I think to see all of that through the hot flush menopause lens can be quite diminishing to women. That's why I talk about queenagers, not.
And I think the menopause is that hugely transformational, powerful stepping into your true self, your true power, spiritual journey as well, which is never celebrated. And of course, why would anyone want to celebrate such wisdom coming into the world?
Well, I think it's quite scary to the existing paradigm, isn't it?
Yeah.
You know, I talk a lot in my book about as we get older, we become a lot less pleasing. So I think the corporate world loves a pleasing young woman, don't they? All keen and enthusiastic and rather beautiful in their kind of, you know, work seat. And then when you've kind of done it for 30 years and you're like, well, actually, I think that's a rubbish idea. And I've won all these prizes, so I have a right to say that and call you out that I think that's a rubbish idea, Mr. Big Boss. And we look a bit less pleasing, you know, and then we're not quite so nice to have around, and we've got other things that we want to do, and we're more likely to speak our mind. Much less popular in the corporate. Oh, how unsurprising that we've got a kind of massive exodus of queenagers out of corporate life. And so many women are, you know, senior women within corporates can be kind of handmaidens or geishas to more senior men. I saw a lot of that. So I do think that there's a problem here around the status quo not really liking a kind of feisty woman who doesn't want to be pleasing anymore and wants to speak her mind. But I think the world really needs us.
And what does the brand new story of queenagerdom and women at midlife and beyond look like?
What I hope it looks like is like a kind of queenager revolution, that we step into our power, we're seen in a different way, that we appear much more widely in kind of, you know, advertising and in the culture, and that we're not kind of dismissed as somehow, you know, just having kind of fallen off the conveyor belt and not being necessary anymore. That our true power is kind of resonant within the culture in a much bigger way. That's what I'm trying to do on the map.
Every journey starts with small steps, and I was wondering, what's the one thing listeners, male and female, can do right now to reimagine this story?
Well, I think all of us at midlife need to really hoist on board that the era of kind of retirement is done. You know, if we look at the kind of the massive falls in the stock market over the last few days, we're all going to have to work till, you know, we're really we till we're up till our dotage. I'm probably will have to work till I die. So we've got to find something that we kind of like doing and which feels kind of purposeful and can earn us a living. I think I was in Ireland recently for a lovely literary festival with the poet Paul Muldoon and an Irish musician called Brendan Begley. And they were talking to me about what they called living well on little. So I also think there's something very interesting in our current culture, all the stuff with that kind of climate change, that maybe also this 50-something watershed is about stopping the kind of biggering and the kind of, you know, more stuff and thinking what actually brings me joy, how could I reorientate my life to just really do the things that I love. And so it kind of some of that becoming for me is also like jumping out of all the kind of achievement kind of status milestones that are driving many of us between 25 and 50 and living life on our own terms. And maybe that's also a way that we can kind of get through it without having to do so much work and, you know, have some space and time to do the things that really bring us joy. And so I do think that there's an opportunity at this point to move into a bigger sense of who we, you know, of who we are and trying to make, I feel really passionate about trying to make the world a better place. I spend a lot of time kind of meditating and in nature. And actually the kind of more I do that, the more I want to do that and the less I want to be, you know, on trains or running around being a kind of important honcho, which was definitely very important to me from 25 to 50. So I do think there's a sense at this point of slightly taking the road less travelled, maybe exploring parts of ourselves that we haven't really given much of a chance to develop, and that it doesn't have to be the same and it doesn't have to be necessarily what people expect. I don't think anyone who knew me 10 years ago would have thought I'd be sitting here talking to you about meditation or kind of oneness or unity, but actually those are the things that I feel really passionate about now.
And thank goodness you do, because the work you're doing is so important and amazing.
Oh, thank you, darling. And but the friends, you know, we talk about a new tribe. You know, you've become a really good friend of mine, and we've really been through a lot of stuff together over the last few years. So I really believe in the importance of the kind of support and love of new friends, new women and men, you know, at this point, and people that you meet in this transformational phase who can see something that you could become really before you've even believed that you can be that yourself.
Yeah.
And that's the great joy and love of people who kind of can see in you this potential that you're not even really sure exists yet yourself. We can kind of co-create that with each other.
And that, I think that's really infused into the Noon Circles as well.
I hope so.
Yeah. I really felt that in Cheltenham, really did.
It's so random how things grow. I mean, the very first Noon Circle, I literally put in my Queen Age newsletter, I will be sitting in this flat, my mum's consulting room in Soho at this time. You know, come. It was a pretty mad thing to do.
Yeah.
And some people turned up, not that many to begin with, but it's really grown from that total like tiny nucleus. And so my real urging to people listening to this is that you really can make a difference, you know, just you with your little idea.
Yeah.
And if you stick with it and you believe in it and you can corral through your story other people to come along on that journey, that is how we change the world. The world's, you know, only ever been changed by small groups of concerned people who sit in a small room, you know, and believe it. And that we can do that. And I think in our culture, that sense of possibility is sometimes lacking. It's one of the, you know, I know America's got big problems at the moment, but I was out over there recently to launch my book. And there is a wonderful acceptance of, you know, of the potential of that kind of new vision, new leadership over there. It's much easier over there to go, oh, you know, I'm the Queen Age lady and, you know, I believe in this. And they all go, yeah, fantastic, go you. Whereas in England, there's a bit of a kind of, oh, who does she think she is? Or you feel that there's a bit of that. You can't be quite so bullish about it.
Yeah, it's different, isn't it?
So in terms of storytelling, I think that the capacity of a story to kind of change the world and a personal narrative to define who you are, I think that that's much better understood and accepted in America than it is here. And maybe we need a bit more of that because the old hierarchical organizations are all falling away. We're all going to end up working much more like you and I do now, running our own things, kind of as consultants, whatever. And so we're all going to have to get better at exactly what you do, your kind of brand new story and articulating who we are and what it's about.
Yeah. And it's actually about, it doesn't start with us. It's about making our customers, so in your case, the Queenagers, making them the heroes of the story, and any of those businesses that decide, actually, we want to recruit more older women, we want to advertise to more older women. They're all the heroes of your story, and you are their mentor.
Yeah.
So where can we find out more about you and your work?
So go to noon.org.uk. So that's noon as in
Yeah.
the middle of the day. And that is our website. It's a community. We're kind of premium community for women in the UK, home of the Queenager. Also, and I write every week a free newsletter called The Queenager. So if you just go to noon.org.uk, you can sign up. But we also,
Yeah.
if you want to come to a Noon Circle or to Noon events, you need to become a paid member. Very cheap, like price
It
of
is.
coffee. You can buy my book. It's published by HarperCollins. It's from Amazon or Waterstones or anywhere you might like to look. And you can also listen to it on audiobook, which I read myself. So if you like this podcast or you listen to another podcast, you might like the Audible book. And I'm speaking at lots of different literary festivals and things over the summer.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
And thank you for everything you're doing to change the story of women at midlife.
Well, thank you, darling, and thanks for all you're doing too, because I think your work about the importance of storytelling is also a crucial part of this.
If anything you've heard today has inspired you to want to create a brand new story for your company, please visit brandnewstory.co.uk to find out more. And to support the show, please can you hit that subscribe button, leave a review, and share this episode with other pioneers in your network. And remember, keep pushing those boundaries, keep standing up for those stories, and I'll see you next time.